Okay, Alla Prima painting, still working on this thing. One thing I forgot to mention was that I like to use violet, so this is a purple colored pencil to do a lot of the darker shading and stuff. It just kind of helps to really push it closer to black. Again, we try not to use black whenever we can avoid it, and so I'm just adding a little bit more shading to try to make this look more dimensional. So we teach our kids here at Fort Hays State University in the studio program to always make sure they are using color to shade as much as possible. The black just seems to really kill the color in terms of muting it. It just takes a lot of its expressive capacity away. And so again, this is kind of like painting with respect to the idea that you're loading lots of color up to make something that's illusionistic. And so if you have a spot that looks dark and you want to really shade it, I'd use violet to get there instead of black so that we don't have that coming through. But forgot to mention that, and so here I'm kind of doing the last little bit of the shading on here, making sure I have everything looking right, you know, in terms of the dark stuff, you know, the highlights, so on and so forth. This one definitely needs to be darker because I want that to look hollow. It is hollow, so I want to really show that with the depth of color. And so hopefully you're starting to see that value start to recede these areas and make it a lot darker. So okay, now that I have this worked out, I'm going to go ahead and separate my foreground space from my background space. And one of the principles of painting anything to be illusionistic is the practice of working from back to front. In other words, we have like an order of progression in terms of space here. This is furthest away from the viewer. It's the dark area. So looking at this right here, you know, it's going to be further away. These are going to overlap this area, so we know that they're in front of this. They also overlap this. So there's sort of this order where we have this furthest away, right? This is next, and then this is going to be closest to us down here as it progresses forward. So those overlapping things tell us what we need to paint first. I'm going to paint this background first because if I mess up and I accidentally get it on my avocados, what I can do is I can paint that back out over the top because opaque or acrylic paint can be opaque and you can block that back out. So I'm going to paint that, allow it to dry. I'm going to paint this and allow it to dry. And so what I've selected is just a brown for this. I'm going to make maybe some orange, some yellow in there, mostly black back here, and I'm probably going to use just a touch of blue to kind of push that. So all right, I'm going to start back here. And again, just using acrylic paints. I use kind of cheaper paints, honestly, which is fine. You know, you sometimes have to build it up a little bit heavier. And so I'm going to start first with my blue. And you can see that I've got yellow, red, blue here, and that's going to be for these things out here. And so as you're painting, be mindful of your contours. So again, I'm using blue, or I'd use violet or something like that, because I want to kind of push this space back from the viewer. Cool colors have a tendency to recede away. And so I'm not trying to like make a sky or say, okay, this is where the clouds would be or whatever. I'm just creating an environment or a landscape type environment that would read as more flat than these avocados. And so I just kind of like to lay this down. You can see my paint's already starting to dry, which is fine because I can work my black back over it. That's what I like about acrylic paint, is that it dries fast. A lot of people hate that because it dries quickly, but that's why you want to do this under drawing here that kind of helps you know what you're doing. And you only want to model like one part at a time, which I'll get to here in a minute. So again, and it's okay to leave brush strokes. A lot of artists like brush strokes. They're very expressionistic. If you're somebody who's really clean, you want to clean that up. Just wait for it to dry, give it a second coat, it should be good to go. And I'm not worried about this because I'll clean it up later. I am going to be a little bit worried about this, so I'm going to try to get in there as close as I can. See, this brush is a little big for that area, so I may switch brushes here. So this is just as much about like pencil control. You get a brush control, you're going to use the same kind of ideas. I'm using a pincher grasp to help me really get this in and around these subjects here. So the reason I like to follow painting with drawing first is because I like my students to begin by drawing and then work into the idea of using paint over it. So now what I'm going to do, turns out I didn't need to use a smaller one, and so I've got a little bit on my avocado. I'll clean it up, no big deal. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same brush. It's still got some blue in it, but I want it to mix anyway. I'm going to start laying black over here. My hope is that you'll see how much more muted this is than this. And again, it's more interesting to go with the background that's going to be more interesting to look at, and shouldn't just all maybe be black or blue. We'll shade that blue with a little bit of black to kind of create an atmosphere. Should be darker on the side anyway, because this is indicating a light source from this side. So it'll all make sense once I get that stuff together. So you can see I have paper down. And again, if you don't really scrub your paper, and I'm not using any water. I don't like to use water with my acrylic paint. It just thins it out too much, and you don't get that really impasto thick look of paint. Plus, it destroys your paper pretty badly. The only time I use water with acrylic paint is if I was going to do a wash, like a watercolor wash, which can be done. Or to clean my brushes, to be 100% honest with you. So I'm just gonna go through here and do some brushing, kind of some hatching, different things to kind of help that environment look a little darker and more uniform. I'm gonna go back to my blue, maybe add a little bit of blue in with this black so that it's not just all black over here. Those nuances do show. A lot of people think, oh, I'll just mix up a dark blue, but rather blend it on the paper, blend it on your canvas, because that's going to be a lot more interesting to look at. You get to see the artist making choices on the canvas, so to speak. Okay, cool. So I'm going to let that dry at this point. I'm pretty happy with it. And then I'm just going to clean my brush. And the way I like to have my kids clean their brush is just use water first to rinse all that stuff out. And then I use soap and cold water in my hand to create like a foam. And then I rinse it out and then dry it off with a paper towel. So I'll do that now. And then I'll go to the background.